to know one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible?
Enlighten me on this contradiction. I'm sure no Christian scholars have already refuted this.
The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most important events in Christianity, and you'd think that supposedly his disciples would have been present and they would have heard and seen the same thing.
To start off, not all 12 apostles or disciples of Jesus were present at the crucifixion. Jesus prophesies this to them in Matthew chapter 26, verse 31. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." Later in the same chapter, the temple guards come to arrest Jesus, and in verse 56 we read, "Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." Now, there was one disciple who witnessed the crucifixion according to John's Gospel. For while Jesus is on the cross, we read in John chapter 19 verse 26, "When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, 'Woman, here is your son.'" Then, in verse 35, we read that the beloved disciple is the one who wrote this gospel, or who the gospel eyewitness testimony is based on. He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. So the account of the crucifixion of Jesus is reliant on the eyewitness testimony of the beloved disciple, or John, and the other woman, such as Mary, the mother of Jesus.
But it's quite shocking that none of the Gospels can agree on what Jesus' last words were. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' last words were, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," and then he died. However, in the Gospel of John, his last words were simply, "It is finished," and then he died. But wait, it gets even worse. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Now, let's go in order of the events and see how this claim can easily be refuted. Now, to start off, it's important to note that Mark and Matthew both say the exact same thing with regard to the final words and death of Jesus, which is especially interesting as this Muslim claimed all the gospel accounts and the disciples who wrote them differed on the last words of Jesus. So what does Matthew and Mark say? We read in both that at 3 o'clock Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Funny enough, this is not Jesus' last words in Mark and Matthew's Gospel. We read just a couple verses later in both Gospels that, "Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last." So what was this loud voice or cry Jesus gave out before he died? Luke tells us. We read in Luke chapter 23 verse 46, "Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.' Having said this, he breathed his last." So far, this is not a contradiction at all. In fact, this suggests that their accounts follow one another, because Luke records Jesus' loud cry, which Matthew and Mark also speak of. So how does John's Gospel fit into this picture? We read in John chapter 19 verse 30, "When Jesus had received the wine, he said, 'It is finished.' Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." Now this saying of Jesus could have been easily said after Jesus drank the wine in the other three Gospels, and John simply doesn't record Jesus saying, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," or my God, why have you forsaken me?" Notice how none of the Gospels say, "And this was Jesus' last words." And this concept is important, as they are not transcripts of what literally exactly happened or was said. There's also one more position you can take, and that's that John's Gospel is simply paraphrasing what happened, or what was said, instead of saying all the individual sayings of Jesus before he died. In fact, New Testament scholar Mike Lacona says this.
John, when you come to John, instead of saying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" he says, "I'm thirsty." That's the penultimate statement. And then, but the very last statement is, "It is finished." So instead of saying, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit," he says, "It is finished." Now, it means pretty much the same thing, you could say, but it would show the extent to perhaps to which one of them, probably John, is paraphrasing. And Johannine specialists all seem to agree that John is, he's reporting different tradition in terms of the stories, but he's also doing some things with Jesus's words. So, for example, no one really questions the orthodoxy or conservatism of F.F. Bruce. F.F. Bruce, in his commentary on the Gospel of John and introductory information material, says that what John does with the Jesus tradition is it's a translation of the freest kind. It's an expanded paraphrase and a transposition into another key. You've got Paul Anderson, a Johannine specialist, saying he calls John a theological paraphrase.
In the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus' last words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is not only a contradiction, but it implies that Jesus abandoned his faith in his last moments. Imagine the final words of who they see as God, and yet they couldn't get that right. So imagine what other details they must have completely messed up.
Yeah, this is utterly wrong. Jesus never lost his faith. He's literally quoting from Psalm chapter 22, verse 1, where David says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish? Jesus is simply fulfilling this prophecy of suffering in Psalm 22. In fact, when Jesus or someone else fulfills a prophecy, many times he'll quote the verse from the Old Testament. For example, when the people don't understand his parables, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 6 verse 9 and says, you will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more content like this, please like and subscribe. And as always, God bless.